In this video, we're going to learn about what functions are, what methods are, and how to create our own functions. So over the course of creating a game, there will be many times when you have to create your own function. And what a function is simply a something that takes in some form of input, does something with that input, and then spits out an output. Right? So that's exactly what a function is in maths, and that's what a function is in programming. So some of the functions we've already used include this print function. So you have print, and then functions usually have these brackets after their names, and then we've given it some form of input, right? So the print function is created inside of the Unity Engine namespace. Here, when you've typed it in here, this is called calling the function, right? So you've called it, and then it's gone to its Unity Engine namespace, found where it says print, and then gives it this input, and then the back code does something with that input, right? It'll print it to the console. So how do we write our own functions? If I come outside this update, so if I click on update, this is the end of update. Usually when these start getting long, I like to just comment where the end is, end of update. So I know where all the ending braces are. And to create a new function, you start off with the data type, right? So if your function is going to spit out a integer at the end, you have to start with an int. Our function is not going to spit out anything, it's just going to do some stuff. So we're going to type in void, right? And then we choose a function name. So what I want to do is replace these and these with a function. And the reason for that is these are exactly the same. And a fundamental concept in programming is called DRY, D-R-Y, which stands for do not repeat yourself. So if you're starting to write lines of code that look similar or are exactly the same, right? It's probably a good idea to replace that with a function. And that's good for memory allocation because it's smaller, but also for, sorry, when I say smaller, I mean it'll make this coding file smaller. And the more small all your coding files are, the faster your game will execute and load programmers to see, right? Instead of coming here and then looking at all this, and then looking at all this, I can do something. Creating functions does something called encapsulation, which means it hides a lot of the details. So that's how you create the function. You put in the parentheses and then you put in some braces, right? And I'm just going to cut that code. Whoops, Control X, and paste it here, right? And then instead of all that code, I'm just going to type in the name of the function followed by some parentheses. So this is where we've created the function, and this is calling the function. So whenever you call a function, it's just going to look for that function and then execute all the code inside it, right? So I can replace this as well with flip, like that. And as I said before, this is a part of encapsulation, which means it's hiding the details. So when a programmer comes to read all this, right, he's just going to say if is flipped was true, flip it, right? He knows that we're just flipping something. And all this doesn't matter as long as it's working. So this is just where my flip function is. And if I really care, then I can open it and have a look to see what the flip function is doing. It's also better for errors, right? So imagine if instead of rotating, I wanted to do the scale. I wanted to scale it instead, right? Instead of having to come and change it twice, I now have to just change. I can now just change it once and it'll work. Okay, so those are what functions are. Methods are just function that's part of a class, right? So input is a class inside of Unity, and this .access is a method of that input class, right? So this is just a function that was defined inside the input class, which is inside of this Unity Engine namespace. So if I go look at, for example, this here, right? This transform was just a transform object, which was derived from the transform class, right? So because, see, this is where we set it in the last video, right? We know that it's a transform object. And all transform objects, if we go to the documentation, all transform objects will have similar properties and methods. Properties are just like variables that's inside that class, right? So if I go back to my class that I created, right? So we've created this class called player controller, right? So all this, for example, is flipped is a property of the player controller class. And methods are functions that's inside that class. So this dot rotate was a method. So when I say dot rotate, sorry, I meant just rotate is a method inside this transform class. So it's just a function that was defined of transform, right? And when you access a method like this, right, you still have to pass it input because it's just a function. But this dot just means look for it inside of this class or this object that was derived from that class. So it's the same thing here. Get access, right, was defined inside an input class. So when I say dot get access, it's saying go look inside this input object, and that input object will have a get access method. And the get access method is just a function that was defined inside that input class, and I'm passing it some information, which is that horizontal axis. Cool. So when we create our own function down here, void flip, all we've done is created a method for our class, which is called player controller. Right. So later on, if other scripts want to access this, they can type in player controller dot flip, and it'll flip the player. Right. It's not as easy as that, obviously. You have to get the component for this script, etc. But you kind of get what I'm talking about. And that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll actually get our characters moving and jumping.